Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, second part thereof for the 4th of May 2025. May the 4th be with you, of course, and dressed up in Vyshyvankas, so what's not to like? We are going to talk about the geopolitical world concerning the war in Ukraine, stretching out occasionally into a larger to the larger landscape of politics in the world. The largest number of restrictions, that's what we're going to start with, was imposed by the United States in an analysis here on sanctions. So since 2014, approximately 29,000 sanctions have been imposed against Russia, mainly by the US. Of course, they had a bit of a head start with being more concerned with Russia and Ukraine since 2014 to 2022, then more recently have taken a step back, but actually were pumping up sanctions, particularly towards the end of the Biden administration anyway, mainly the US, Canada and Switzerland, according to a report. So the largest number of restrictions was imposed by the US, 7,384, 25.5% of all restrictions. The top three included Canada, 3,639 with a share of 12.6%, and Switzerland, 3,266 with a share of 11.3%. I wonder if the EU itself is not part of that report and whether it is a case of looking at individual countries and pitting them against each other. But yeah, I'll be interested to see that, because the EU now, with the 17th package of sanctions, I bet the EU is in a different position now than it certainly was, particularly going back to 2014. Now, Russia will be the one to suffer the most of this OPEC plus speed up of oil output hikes. I talked about this yesterday. I reported on it to some degree. Just a little bit more detail here as to what's going to happen. OPEC plus. So there's this group, just in case you don't know, a group called OPEC, the core group. It works basically as a cartel, really, to try and organize the production of oil in order to control prices. So if you control most of the supply of oil, now the US is not in OPEC, but OPEC is kind of pitted against the US really in kind of vying for what's a good optimal position to have with regard to oil production to maximize the profits and maximize the price. But actually it's not always about profits and price. Sometimes it's about, a kind of zero-sum game approach to, say, the US, for example, as being not in OPEC and OPEC plus. Obviously, other nations as well, the UK, etc., etc. But it's basically vying for, I guess, profitability, eking out supply for the long term while sort of maximizing, and power. But essentially, there's a lot of cartel seen in that. And then you've got OPEC plus, which includes Russia, these kind of associated nations with OPEC, more aligned to the kind of Middle Eastern approach, i.e. the anti-American approach, I would guess, just from that kind of economic point of view. And that's, Russia's in OPEC plus. They may unwind 2.2 million barrels per day voluntary cut by November. Speedy hikes likely in July, August and September and October. Saudi Arabia warns against non-compliance. Oil fell to a 4-year low in April, below $60 a barrel, and Trump is to visit Saudi Arabia in May. So there's a lot of headlines there. So OPEC Plus will accelerate all oil output hikes, and that could bring back to the market as much as 2.2 million barrels per day by November. 5 OPEC Plus sources said as the group's leader, Saudi Arabia, seeks to punish some fellow members for producing above quotas. OPEC Plus shocked oil markets in April by agreeing a bigger than expected output hike for May, despite weak prices and slowing demand. OPEC's de facto leader, Saudi Arabia, designed the move to punish Iraq and Kazakhstan for poor compliance with production quotas, as Riyadh signalled it is unwilling to prop up the market any longer, sources have said. The developments take place days before the US President Donald Trump is due to visit Saudi Arabia to discuss an arms package and a nuclear agreement. Trump has repeatedly asked OPEC Plus to pump more oil to help ease gasoline prices as he faces inflation pressures at home, including from his tariff wars. This is fascinating because Low oil prices is exactly what the US wants, and Trump had talked about drill baby drill to try and flood the market, really to keep prices down, and that's one way of coping with rising inflation. There are other pressures on inflation, but energy is a big one. The more it costs to transport stuff, the more stuff costs, the greater the pressure on inflation, the higher inflation will be. And so that's one thing, although as a government, you can't really dictate very easily the amount of oil that's pumped. That actually, you're kind of trying to leave that to the free market to decide, but you can put pressure on here and there. You can talk about opening up drilling sites and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that he wants the oil to be pumped out at greater rates. Saudi Arabia is in agreement with that to try and keep some of these other nations in line, and that will also affect Russia massively. So the more you pump, the cheaper it becomes. The less profit you're going to make per barrel. And actually, in Russia's case, if it goes too low, you're making a loss, and then the more you pump, the more you're losing. And if you agree to this, which I think Russia has, I don't think they've got any choice, then you are going to be producing more and more stuff at a loss, and that's going to create larger losses, and it's economically kind of suicidal to a degree. So the shift in Saudi policy suggests the kingdom wants to expand its market share, a major change after 5 years spent balancing the market through deep output cuts. OPEC Plus, which includes the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries and allies such as Russia, is cutting output by almost 5 million barrels per day, or 5% of global demand. The cuts were agreed in various stages since 2022 to support the market, and many cuts are due to remain in place until the end of 2026. In December, OPEC Plus agreed to gradually phase out the 2.2 million barrels per day voluntary part of total cuts by the end of September 2026, but decided in April to accelerate that process from May. The group agreed another big output hike for June on Saturday, taking the total it plans to release in April and May and June to nearly 1 million barrels per day. They'll maintain the trend and will likely agree in June to release another 411,000 barrels per day in July. The 5 OPEC Plus sources briefed on the matter said, speaking on condition of anonymity. Saudi Arabia repeated its warnings against poor compliance on Saturday, one of the sources said. So we will see what Russia does in response to that. OPEC, the Saudi's government's communications office, and the office of Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak did not immediately reply to a request for comment. So I wonder, if Russia are going to be particularly unhappy about that. Now, Romanians are going to the voting booths in the presidential election day after that was annulled due to the influence from Russia. Now, it's looking pretty challenging for those who in the pro-EU liberal side of things, because one of the favourites is George Simeon, an ultra-nationalist, far-right Eurosceptic. Romanians are heading to the polls today in the first round of the presidential election. And that could bring Simeon to power there. Something to definitely watch out for. Now, a lot to be said about Viktor Orban. There's this growing from already a place of much discord and discontent. Viktor Orban and Zelenskyy seem to be having something of a public tete-a-tete at the moment. Viktor Orban responded to Zelenskyy about this idea that Hungary are going to put the kibosh on Ukraine joining the EU. Orban has said, without Hungary, there will be no accession. Even Hungarians will have their say, whether you like it or not, dismissing a poll cited by Zelenskyy showing that 70% of Hungarians support Ukraine's EU bid. So what Viktor Orban said in a tweet. President Zelenskyy addressed the Hungarian people yesterday. Mr. President, what the Hungarian people think is not decided by the President in Kyiv or the bureaucrats in Brussels. There is no Ukrainian EU accession without Hungary. Every Hungarian will have their say on this. Whether you like it or not, that's how we do things here. Wow, I really wish you were as openly democratic as you are claiming. Now, Zelensky slams Orban for dragging Ukraine into Hungary's elections and blocking the EU path. He's doing very dangerous things, Zelensky had said, accusing Orban of using Ukraine as a political tool, while most Hungarians actually support Ukraine's EU accession. That's what he had said to then stimulate Orban's rebuttal. Peter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, says Kiev must accept Budapest blocking Ukraine's EU accession. Zelensky says most Hungarians support Ukraine. So again, the idea that Szijjártó's parroting Orban's position there. Hungary's Orban-backed referendum on Ukraine's EU future began in mid-April and will last through May. So that's quite a long referendum period, I would suggest. But I'm sure they'll try their hardest to rig that. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has ignored 6 meeting requests from Zelensky, including an invitation to Kyiv, just days before confirming his attendance at Russia's victory parade. I think that's really disappointing. I think Lula is being weak there, very much beholden to Russia. Some will argue that that is kind of economically necessary, as there is an intractable integration of these two, the Russians and the Brazilians, given the need for fertilizer and the provision of fertilizer by Russia for the Brazilian farmers. So there are very close links, but it would be nice if morality played a part in that. Now, talking about the Victory Day parade, India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh has cancelled his visit to Moscow's Victory Day parade, and that comes after, as we know, Prime Minister Modi had decided not to turn up to the Victory Day parade. So it's now going to be left to the Deputy Defence Minister. We've heard that Vucic said he was ill, but actually might be going now. There were claims that he wasn't going to go. And Robert Fico, the Slovakian leader, wasn't going to go, but now apparently is going to go. And I think Xi Jinping is still on the cards to be there from the, is it the 6th of May on to the 9th? Or certainly for a few days before the Victory Day and on Victory Day parade itself. Swedish Migration Minister Johan Forsell is outraged by the May the 9th pro-Russian rallies in Stockholm that have been planned, tied to the Kremlin-linked Immortal Regiment. We saw a march in the United States as well, which I think is pretty distasteful. He suggests revoking residence permits for participants, saying Sweden won't host those who threaten public order. And in fact, if we go back to, let's bring in this source as well, because it's relevant. In Washington, an Immortal Regiment march was allowed. I reported this morning in my hits and losses video in the other section. Russians paraded from the White House to the World War II memorial, chanting victory and we wish you health. Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian activists were present, holding signs in support of Ukraine to remind Americans that Russia is a terrorist state. It was pretty horrible, actually. There's a lot of these flags have the, as you can see, hammer and sickle. In fact, all of those ones you can see there, apart from the pro-Ukraine ones further back. These, you've got marching through capitalist America and the streets there, these kind of pro-communist flags. Now, of course, freedom of speech, etc., etc. But isn't it interesting how so many people on particularly the MAGA Republican right who have kind of found themselves against Ukraine and for Russia are sort of embracing, one would assume, communism in light of their own background of capitalism. And it's just this weird thing where, I don't know, there's so many distorted mental contortions that are going on. In the mind of many Americans in this case, such that they end up supporting Russia, even given all of the positions they would otherwise, in any other context, completely eschew. Right, Geopolitics Panier talks. We're actually going to go back to Viktor Orban here. I should have had this a couple of tabs earlier, sorry. Orban turned Central Europe's one-time success story into its poorest state and the EU's most corrupt, distracting from real economic woes with fake threats. He brands it conservative, but it's just corruption. Ex-EU ambassador David Pressman breaks it down on CNN here. So it's a really useful synopsis from the ambassador, who was really critical of Hungary, and then was, I presume, pulled out of Hungary by the incoming Trump administration, who sees Hungary and Viktor Orban as huge allies. But of course, Pressman would have a much more accurate appraisal of Hungary as being an illiberal state in the heart of the EU that are causing problems for everyone and everything who would otherwise be striving for democracy, political transparency. Orban is a corrupt leader of a nation that is struggling, and it's just very odd but completely unsurprising that the Trump administration is aligning themselves with them. Let's see if I can pick out a particularly pertinent excerpt here from the 6.5 minute interview. So let's start with Trump's own opinion of Orban.
Viktor Orban, who's a very strong man and very respected. And Viktor Orban, one of the toughest leaders in the world, the strong people. The press hates him. They say, he's a tough leader. Well, sometimes you need a tough leader. But highly intelligent guy, very strong person from Hungary. There's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic.
Up front now, David Pressman, the former U.S. ambassador to Hungary and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Security Council. Also right now a partner at a law firm currently in litigation against the Trump administration. As such, you aren't able to talk about that. But here on the 100 days, as Trump is celebrating 100 days in office, looking at Hungary is so crucial, right? And he has said Orban is the best leader. There's no one smarter. He's a strong person. What is the reality?
Yeah, well, I think President Trump has been sold a bill of goods, because the reality is that Viktor Orban is a leader who has fundamentally held himself out as being a bulwark against these woke liberal ideologies that he proclaims are attempting to invade Hungary to undermine Hungarianness. But in reality, what Prime Minister Orban has led is a government that has effectively, for the last 15 years, taken a country that was really the shining star of the post-communist period and had so much hope, and turned it into a country that has one of the poorest economies in Europe, the most corrupt country in the European Union, and continues to distract from real problems by virtue of pointing to fake ones. And that's really dangerous.
So let me ask you about that, because, CPAC, the well-known conservative conference, right? They've celebrated him. They even had a CPAC in Budapest, right? Hungary has become this shining star. Tucker Carlson took a show there to say, let me show you the truth about Hungary, right? And it is then portrayed in those contexts as a conservative beacon. Very much the opposite of what you're describing economically. So you say that what's happening in Hungary, though, is not conservatism. It's actually corruption.
It is.
So
100%.
Well, what Orban has done is he's constructed a system of rewards and punishments. And the rewards, he rewards those who are loyal to him quite handsomely. And you don't have to look very far. So, for instance, the Prime Minister's best friend from childhood, who 10 years ago was a plumber, is now a billionaire. He's the richest person in Hungary. The Prime Minister's son-in-law is on track to become the richest person in Hungary. This is not, difficult fact-finding. It's quite obvious. And for those who are opposed to the Prime Minister, or not even opposed, for those who exhibit any voice of independence, they feel the force of all state resources going after to target them and penalize them. And it's not just politicians, it's churches, it's universities. I'll give you an example, Aaron. Mm-hmm. There was a university that refused to limit its academic freedom and limit its studies and kowtow to the Orban administration. Viktor Orban went after that university's accreditation and effectively forced what was the most prominent regional university, degree accrediting university, out of Budapest. And meanwhile, a purported university that is run by Orban's own political director receives $1 billion in funding, largely from Russian oil deals. And so it's very clear, if you want to exist in Viktor Orban's Hungary, what you have to do.
And obviously.
And I'll leave it there. But, really worthwhile interview from Erin Burnett with Pressman, just showing how Orban is just grifting and corrupting the government in Hungary. President Zelensky's met with the Luxembourgish Foreign Minister Javier Bettel and Defense Minister Eureka Beckers. to thank them for the defence and energy aid and discuss rebuilding Kryvyi Rih and Ukraine's EU path. It could be that Luxembourg is going to be sort of twinned with Kryvyi Rih in the same way that Mykolaiv is something that Denmark is interested in looking after, and I think Zaporizhia. Certain countries have certain areas that they are looking to support. But also we've had Zelenskyy speaking to the new Prime Minister, or re-elected Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese. Strengthening air defence remains our key priority, he had said, to protect our people, and we count on our partners' support. We also discuss ways to further enhance Ukraine's security and defence capabilities. He's also today in the Czech Republic, where he will meet the Czech leaders, heads of defence companies, students and the Ukrainian communities. His wife is also with him there. A key topic will be the development of military aviation and expanding F-16 training programs. We're preparing good news for Ukraine, he said. Now, I'm going to be talking about this in my military aid update, but they are looking at starting a training school there for F-16s, but actually Czechia doesn't operate F-16, so I don't know how that's going to work. But also talk about how Czechia is really helping with artillery ammunition, and there's a ramping up of provision of that kind of stuff. So really good news there. Next, we move on to Lithuania. Visit Russia more than once every 3 months. Lithuania now strips your residence permits, so really going after people with the potential to have a lot of Russian influence there. The Baltic nation implements tough new restrictions while Hungary relaxes entry rules. Two vastly different approaches to the Russian threat on EU borders. Of course, we've heard before about the Hungarian approach to giving visas easily to Russians to enter Hungary, and then they have access to the whole of Europe through the Schengen agreement, so the free movement of people. That is highly problematic. Now, Institute for the Study of War reports that Russian rhetoric towards Lithuania could set the stage for military action. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has authored a foreword to a Kremlin-linked book that accuses Lithuania of historical falsification and Russophobia, and that is potentially a precursor to ramping up rhetoric, maybe activity against Lithuania. Those Baltics are already first in the firing line to the Russians after Ukraine, of course. Now, going just further north a little bit, up to the border of Finland, we hear that there are no windmills in eastern Finland because they are considered to interfere with the use of radar. But now the idea has turned 180 degrees. Now they want a wall of over 1,000 windmills on the eastern border that will be equipped with the latest radar technology. How clever would that be if actually these windmills would not only be useful for renewable energy generation, but could act as a radar defense against Russian interference there. Now, let's go on to Ukraine and the minerals deal. Soviet-era maps. War risks stall US mineral projects in Ukraine. What's going on here? This is a Euromaidan press article saying that experts claim the US access to Ukrainian resources remains years away due to security risks, damaged infrastructure, and a lack of modern geological surveys. So some of these analyses and the maps of where all of these resources are go back to Soviet eras and are not indeed accurate enough. Ukraine has deposits of 22 of the 50 minerals listed as critical by the US, according to the Ukrainian government. Some of these deposits are in area under Russian occupation, however. So the high-profile US-Ukraine mineral extraction deal, promoted earlier as a breakthrough in strategic partnership, faces serious obstacles due to outdated geological data, war risks, and weak rare earth reserves. Actually, the reserves aren't quite as good as people were thinking. That was an issue that was coming to the fore when, after the initial demands were being made for Ukrainian rare earths by Trump himself, according to industry experts. So in the Washington Post, US President Donald Trump is urging Ukraine to begin negotiations with Russia amid the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. Additionally, he pushed an initially one-sided mineral deal, giving the US exclusive control over profits and imposing 4% interest, while retroactively converting past US aid into debt. Ukraine has signed reportedly a more balanced version, though the documents are unpublished and require parliamentary approval. This is absolutely not a solution to these immediate problems, said Reid Blakemore of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, referring to the US dependence on China for metals vital to weapons, electronics, and battery production. So, this minerals deal could be very, very important for the US, but it is coming up against some of the aforementioned problems that mean it could not be the immediate solution to the problems that the US is facing. So we'll have to see how it all turns out. Now, what's also happened since the minerals deal has kind of been signed, there's obviously ratification in the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, yet to take place, but there has then been this flurry of activity and certainly talk concerning Ukraine buying weapons off the US. Is it that actually that was being held over the Ukrainians as a kind of blackmail, as a carrot for the Ukrainians to sign the minerals deal? Now the minerals deal is seemingly kind of sorted. You're suddenly seeing all of this activity. Zelensky's hands were untied. Ukraine went berserk. The armed forces of Ukraine hit Crimea and Novorossiysk after a deal with Trump. So not only are we seeing these sales of equipment that seem to have been unlocked by the minerals deal, but we've actually seen attacks into Russia on a scale that we'd seen previously at times, and I've been wanting to see that much more consistently for Ukraine. It could be that they've been holding back because there have been demands from the US to, I don't know, not strike Russia because they want to get this deal sorted, don't want to jeopardize the deal, don't want to piss off Russia too much. Well, apparently Russia are pretty annoyed about this US Ukraine minerals deal, and it might well have damaged the ability to take negotiations much further, certainly at the moment. So that's an interesting dynamic. But also, one must wonder whether the deal, as it says here in the tagline, the deal with Trump untied Zelensky's hands for strikes on Novorossiysk and Crimea. Wow. So interesting. We shall see. Right. President Trump has said, well, let's leave him to talk here and cast our opinion afterwards.
Deal with Ukraine. It's a sign, it seems, that the United States is invested in Ukraine's future. The Secretary of State told me this is a very critical week. Are you any closer to reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
I hope so.
How would you characterize
I do believe we're closer with one party and maybe not as close with the other, but
closer with one party than the other. Interesting. Is that an admission that Ukraine are playing ball and Russia are being intransigent? Or is he slagging off Ukraine? Maybe Ukraine's further away. But the implication I get from that is that Russia are being the difficult ones, and that could be what is underwriting the American frustration with Russia at the moment, whereby they are talking more about sanctions than we've heard in recent times.
We'll have to see. I'd like to not say which one we're closer to, but we did do a deal for the American people that was good. We were able to get rare earth. You know, the Europeans are getting paid back. They have a loan. We didn't. Biden just gave them $350 billion. He has no idea where the money is, what happened.
This is all incorrect, by the way. What he's saying is all incorrect. There were some loan agreements with Europe with regard to how they gave aid to Ukraine, but also not. And they do know where that weaponry has gone. In fact, it's far more closely monitored than weaponry that's gone, say, to Afghanistan. So this is really not helpful rhetoric from Trump yet again.
Happened, and at least we'll, in one form or another, get our. I don't feel so foolish. And remember this is Biden's war. This was a war that was never going to happen if I were president. This is a horrible, horrible war.
Shut up.
And I get to see shots of soldiers through, satellite that are so terrible. 5,000 soldiers are being, 5,000 soldiers a week on average are dying. They're not American soldiers. But I want to solve the problem. They're Russian soldiers and they're Ukrainian soldiers. And if I can save 5,000 souls, I just love doing it.
How long do you give both countries before you're going to walk away?
Well, there'll be a time when I will say, okay, keep going, keep being stupid.
When does that come? Are you close to it?
Sometimes I get close to it and then positive things happen, okay?
What's the red line for you? At what point do you say, that's it, we're walking away?
Well, you'll know. I mean, there'll be a time when I may say that. And if I do, there may be something I can't, maybe it's not possible to do. There's tremendous hatred, just so you understand. Kristen, we're talking tremendous hatred between these two men and between, some of the soldiers, frankly, between the generals. They've been fighting hard for 3 years.
And actually take that further to 2014. I would like to think that he understands that hatred for the Russians is justified and the hatred for the Ukrainians isn't. I'd like to think he understands that it's not just an equality of both sidesism here, but I severely doubt it.
I think we have a very good chance of doing it.
So he thinks there's a very good chance of doing it, but he's being somewhat guarded there. But interesting comments there from Trump. Now, Trump's spiritual advisor, Mark Burns, and I've reported on this various times, briefed the US president after visiting Ukraine. So he was one that went over, had his mind kind of blown, changed to become much more pro-Ukrainian. Came back and said, I spoke of Russian atrocities against women, children and the elderly. Of 20,000 abducted kids, 700 religious sites targeted, I remain firm. The US must stand with Ukraine in its fight for freedom. And he said the US will not turn its back on Ukraine. That's a spiritual advisor says after briefing the American president. So hopefully that will have had some effect. I really do think people like him, Ben Shapiro, people that exist in the right-wing ecosystem in the United States need to get to Ukraine and understand properly what is going on there, to actually understand the conflict first and foremost as the geopolitical chess game it is, but not understand the conflict through a Russian lens of just listening to Russian propaganda. Now, Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, has been shunted sideways and downwards to the US ambassador to the UN. He was kicked out, people thinking that Signalgate was responsible for it by point of fact that he created this Signal group and included a bunch of people in it, and then Pete Hegseth shared loads of sensitive data in an irresponsible way. But actually, it seems to have been something else that annoyed Donald Trump more. And this is coming from the Washington Post. Waltz also upset Trump after an Oval Office visit in early February by Benjamin Netanyahu, when the national security advisor appeared to share the Israeli leader's conviction that the time was right to strike Iran. One of the people, two of the people said, quote, Rubio, the temporary replacement, hails from the same traditionalist wing of the Republican Party as Waltz, but he has more readily shed his old views, officials say, and has emerged as a forceful spokesman for Trump. That includes policy on Russia and Ukraine. Now, interesting comparison there. It was funny watching the SNL cold open of Trump and Stephen Miller, showing how evil Stephen Miller is, but also then called in Marco Rubio. And part of the skit was he asked Marco Rubio for his opinion. Marco Rubio gave his opinion, then Trump said what? And then Marco Rubio just changed his opinion to Trump. It was all part of the comedy sketch. But that's the reality. What Shashank Joshi here is kind of quoting from and talking to is this idea that Marco Rubio has all these ideas about Putin and Russia and foreign policy that he's been exhibiting and expressing for the last 10 years. And he gets into his role as Secretary of State and he just regurgitates Trump's talking points, or possibly people from around Trump. And he's curtailed his views to exactly what Trump wants him to say. Whereas it appears that Mike Waltz had actually kept some of his core views at the forefront. And one of those was that the US should be hard on Iran, whereas actually Trump, although he's had a lot of very harsh rhetoric against Iran, wanted to fulfill a more diplomatic approach to Iran. And Mike Waltz was agreeing behind Trump's back about Iran with Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about striking Iran, blah, blah, blah. And apparently that really pissed off Trump, where they went into the White House and it turns out Waltz had been doing stuff kind of behind his back. That's how I understand it. and that could be what underwrote Trump's moving of Waltz aside, more so than Signalgate, which was also problematic. Now, Brian Tyler Cohen here says Trump announces he is replacing Veterans Day with Victory Day for World War One. It all sounds very, very Russia-like, doesn't it? Taking away the honour of the day from millions of veterans. So it's not just Veterans Day, it's Victory Day for World War One. So it's become more specific. Donald Trump here stating many of our allies and friends are celebrating May the 8th as Victory Day. I wonder who's doing that in particular, has that big parade. I don't know. Answers on a postcard. But we did more than any other country. Oh, it's American exceptionalism. Okay, we can talk about the role that the US played in World War II. But you can also say, I mean, I know it's controversial, but Russia the Soviet Union played a massive role in Germany losing World War II. So splitting their attention and resources between two front lines and throwing all of that effort into the Soviet Union did for Germany, and then the US coming and joining in, etc., etc. But there's 26 million members of the Soviet Union who died. Many Belarusians, many Ukrainians, of course, fighting against the Nazis in Germany, or in the Soviet Union against the Germans, was hugely impactful in Germany losing the war. It's kind of Napoleonic echoes of fighting a war on two fronts, and it's not cool. But anyway, the US is apparently savior of the universe at all times. But that's not to belittle, of course, the massive impact that the US had on bringing the Second World War to a positive conclusion. But he says, but it's about how there's a way in which you can say these things, and this kind of, I think, really brash bravado is very unbecoming from a leader of the United States. Have some empathy for other countries, have some understanding of the role everyone played in coming together to bring about the end of World War II, while also admitting that the massive material impact of the US was incredibly important. But we did more than any other country, by far, in producing a victorious result on World War II. I am hereby renaming May the 8th as Victory Day for World War II and November the 11th as Victory Day for World War I. We won both wars. Nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery, or military brilliance. But we never celebrate anything. That's because we don't have leaders anymore that know how to do so. So we're going to start celebrating our victories again. It's like nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery. So no one else in the Allied armed forces were nearly as, no one was nearly as brave as the Americans. The Americans were the bravest by a country mile. That's what he's saying here. And everyone else was militarily amateur compared to the military brilliance of the Americans. I'd just be, we can talk about the importance of the US and actually winning World War II from an Allied point of view. Wouldn't have been possible without the US. Yeah, but possibly also not possible without the Soviet Union. But we can talk with far more nuance than this just brash bravado, which I think is really insulting actually to an awful lot of people. Anyway, Keith Olbermann then comes out and said, we won World War II not on May the 8th, but on August the 15th, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered. Trump is a complete moron. So the difference between Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, and VJ, Victory in Japan Day. Now, this is, again, the US getting involved in right-wing populist politics across Europe. He has accepted into the White House the far-right candidate, not the leader, but the candidate. This is endorsement of extremist politics in Europe. I mean, we need to understand where the Trump administration now is. It is endorsing the AfD. It is endorsing here the right-wing, far-right candidate in the Polish presidential election in the White House. it is, it's just, that's how it goes, isn't it? Now, you can argue that the PIS, of a Justice and Law Party, isn't, extreme in a way that some people claim, but I just think there's still an involvement in politics and an endorsement of certain parties that I think is really, really problematic, and the Trump administration seems to do it all the time. Polish nationalist opposition presidential candidate attends White House event. The presidential candidate, backed by Poland's main nationalist opposition party, Law and Justice, attended the National Day of Prayer at the White House on Thursday. His campaign team said Poles will vote in the first round of the presidential election on May the 18th, and maintaining good relations with the United States will be a key task for the head of state of a country that sees Washington's support as essential for its security. Adam Bielan, a PIS member of the European Parliament, posted a picture on X of Karol Nawrocki, the conservative historian backed by the party in the presidential campaign, in the crowd at the event outside the White House before an address by President Donald Trump. The head of Nawrocki's campaign team mocked the frontrunner in the presidential race, Rafał Trzaskowski, from the ruling Civic Coalition, so this is Donald Tusk's coalition, KO, who held a rally with Prime Minister Donald Tusk at the seaside resort of Sopot, Tusk's hometown. So Trzaskowski with Tusk in Sopot, Nawrocki with Trump in the White House, Paweł Szefanecker wrote on X. Anyway, just saw it as an interesting observation there. And then we have Viktor Orban shaking hands with Hannes Weidel of the AfD. So we've got the far right in Germany being endorsed essentially by Viktor Orban. He is starting to get ultra-nationalist support, and we know of the, as we just heard from Pressman, of the very close relationship between the Trump administration and Viktor Orban. And so what we are seeing, understand that the Trump administration, under people like Stephen Miller, and you could argue Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson, with his involvement with Hungary, and Donald Trump and JD Vance, the MAGA Republican movement is no different than AfD, is no different from Rassemblement National, is no different from Viktor Orban's Fidesz party. Once we understand that, we understand that they're just existing in this ecosystem where they're all patting each other on the back. And that's why you get the PIS candidate going out to Trump's White House. That's why you get Marco Rubio and JD Vance getting involved with the designation of AfD as extremists, and then coming over to Europe, as JD Vance did, and having a go at Europeans for not being all freedom of press. Meanwhile, the US completely destroys its own press freedom. But apparently we're not free in Europe because we're not endorsing enough of this right-wing extremism, populism that we are seeing proliferate around Europe. But it is exactly the same as we are seeing in the White House. They are part of this. The US is at the moment, as politically I'm speaking, and I mean the White House is no different from Hungary, from Slovakia, from the AfD, and from Rassemblement National. They are all, in fact, Reform UK, I'd throw in there as well. They're all peas in the same, I think, nationalist, populist pod. And, then you get this.
You and I talked, and I asked you if you would rule out military force to take Greenland, and you said no, you don't rule out anything. Would you rule out military force to take Canada?
Well, I think we're not going to ever get to that point. It could happen. Something could happen with Greenland. I'll be honest. We need that for national and international security.
So, I'm ruling out military force to take Canada, but something could happen with Greenland. He's saying it again, and he's saying it very clearly. Oh, you shouldn't you should take him seriously, but not literally. I don't understand how we should take this. Do we laugh this? He's just threatening military force against Greenland. No. He's saying it seriously when asked a very explicit question and saying, I'm not ruling out military force with regard to Greenland because we need it for national security. He's telling you there very explicitly.
I think it's highly unlikely. I don't see it.
Canada's unlikely.
I just don't see it. I have to be honest with you.
Okay,
well, good. Bloody good.
For Greenland.
And by the way, Canada, They spend less money on military than practically any nation in the world. They pay NATO less than any nation.
This is a problem.
They think we're subsidized. They think we are going to protect them. And really, we are. But the truth is, they don't carry their full share, and it's unfair to the United States and our taxpayers.
But you are not ruling out military force to take Greenland.
I don't rule it out. I don't say I'm going to do it, but I don't rule out anything. No, not there. We need that. We need Greenland very badly. Greenland is a very small amount of people, which we'll take care of, and we'll cherish them and all of that. But
cherish them by invading them militarily. Okay.
We need that for international security.
It's absolutely incredible. Meanwhile, the King of Denmark has visited Nuuk in Greenland. Now, remember when JD Vance says Pekka Kaliniemi and his wife wanted to visit the same town? They had to cancel the trip because no one wanted to meet them. I think Greenlanders are perfectly content being part of Denmark with free healthcare and all. Actually, they will want eventual independence, but they're, I think, much happier to be part of Greenland than they are, to be part of the United States. There is no appetite there, realistically, for them to be invaded by the United States. Now, talking about sort of Russia and China, I haven't really mentioned China, but this is an interesting analysis in The Guardian. It was World Press Freedom Day just the other day, and that's what I talked about, how the US has really dipped in press freedom. It's absolutely tanking at the moment. Quote, a cocktail for the misinformed world, why China and Russia are cheering Trump's attacks on the media. I'm just going to read you the very beginning of this to give you a sense of what's going on. So as Donald Trump's executive order in March led to the shuttering of the Voice of America, the global broadcaster whose roots date back to the fight against Nazi propaganda, he quickly attracted support from figures who not used to aligning themselves with any US administration. Trump had ordered the US Agency for Global Media, the federal agency that funds VOA and other groups promoting independent journalism overseas, to be, quote, eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law. The decision suddenly halted programming in 49 languages to more than 425 million people. I'm going to add a little bit here, at a very, very low cost, really, compared to many things that the US spends money on. Indeed, he wants to have a parade, right? A military parade that's going to cost, I think, is it 92 million? It's estimated to cost. It's estimated that it will cost 92 million. Meanwhile, he wants to close down like NPR and PBS and all of that get 87 million dollar funding. So it's going to shut down something that I think is really important for information in this modern age, and he's going to replace it with spending more money on a parade, a one-day parade for himself. It's insane. In Moscow, Margarita Simonyan, the hardline editor-in-chief of the state broadcaster RT, described it as a, quote, awesome decision. The Global Times, an English-language Chinese state media publication, crowed that the broadcasters had been discarded by the White House, quote, like a dirty rag, ending their, quote, propaganda poison. Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, whose regime has been accused of repressing political opposition, described Trump's move as very promising. Domestically, Trump has continued to target the media, whether by taking outlets including CBS News and ABC to court, attempting to block political access to the White House by the Associated Press, or defund National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting Service, as I just mentioned, institutions he has described as radical left monsters. For many senior media figures from around the world, there's been a tipping of the scales as authoritarian regimes are emboldened by US administration not only attacking the media at home but also withdrawing from the fight for free information overseas. As the world marks Press Freedom Day on May the 3rd, observers are now warning that in countries where free media is weak, America's withdrawal from the Geopolitical Balancing Act will have far-reaching effects. And then it goes on to talk about it's just the terrible things that are taking place. Meanwhile, China and Russia are stepping in. Thank you very much, they say. Deeply worrying movements taking place. Now, in his first 100 days in office, Trump has dropped an anvil on US cybersecurity agencies and programs, according to Politico. And we also hear that he's wanting to sack 1,000 to 1,200 CIA operatives. This is just, again, handing the keys of power to Russia and China, as I keep talking about. This includes massive staff cuts and a campaign of retaliation against top officials who have shown disloyalty. He's much more likely to want to attack people within the US in retribution rather than use cybersecurity to defend the US from attacks from abroad and then, retaliate or proactively work against other nations such as China and Russia. As Russia and China escalate attacks on the US critical infrastructure, the Trump administration's actions have raised concerns in the cybersecurity community. Absolutely. Now, we're going to move slightly off sort of the geopolitical chess game, and we're going to just talk very briefly about the economy and particularly the American economy, but this will have global reach, right? And I just want to play you this snippet. It is so important. So this is a guy that's in charge of the ports of Los Angeles. If you're going to listen to anyone about what's going on with the trade war, listen to the guy that's on the coalface here of the trade war in the ports that is taking in all of that cargo from abroad. So listen to this.
Just describe for us, let's take a beat, really frame it for us, how much volume has just dropped off in the last few weeks?
Yeah, about a third of the import volume, which means give or take about 50,000 20-foot equivalent units gone off the arrivals coming in next week.
From next.
So next week, a third of cargo is disappeared, right? And then it will sort of pick up momentum as he's going to go on to state. That's data that is truly worrying.
Week is when you expect to see this really hit.
That's correct. And that matches up. The announcement's back on April 2nd. Then on April 8th, a little bit of a change on everybody, ex-China, Mexico, Canada. And those arrivals are coming at us this weekend.
We'll, of course, dedicate time to your port, but I'm just wondering how you're anticipating this rolls and ripples through the economy from here, how it hits trucking, when this turns up on the shelf. What's the distance, the time from when you see a drop-off in volume and when we, as consumers, see the shortages?
Right. So CEOs are telling me, hit the pause button, right? I'm not going to import anymore at these kind of prices. Let's wait and see. I don't know if it's going to be 2 hours, 2 days, or 2 weeks till I get some clarity. Then hiring. Off the table for right now. Capital investment, pause. And the retailers are telling me that realistically, with even the 10%, I'm going to have to pass it on to the consumers.
So how much is this really coming from all over? It's not just about China. This is about really global trade coming to a standstill until there is a much greater degree of certainty and a much lower tariff rate than even the baseline that's been put out there.
Yeah, when I was last with you all, Lisa, I said global trade's going to slow, economies will follow, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Back in November, so many of us were wringing our hands about 4% inflation. We've just added 10 percentage points to imports coming out of Southeast Asia for our port, and these unbelievable numbers out of China.
How much are you going to see a real decline in dock workers if this goes on?
Yeah, this is the question. So the trucker hauling 4 or 5 containers today, next week, she probably hauls 2 or 3. The dock workers are no longer going to see overtime and double shifts. They're going to probably work less than a traditional work week, starting right off the bat. Every 4 containers mean a job. So when we start dialing this back, it's less job opportunities.
And what happens if we get a deal?
If we get a deal, it's going to take about a month. Let me walk you through that real quick. About 2 weeks to get the ships repositioned around these major ports, from Qingdao to Shanghai to Xiamen, load up all those containers, and then another 2 weeks to steam across the Pacific to get to us. This is important because now we're talking about spring and summer fashion. So we're kind of at a crux here that we've got to have something pretty quick.
And back to school, which is,
right.
I think, very critical when it comes to political pushback for this administration. We have a story out, it was anecdotal reporting as well. We've heard about China quietly starting to exempt about a quarter of U.S. imports. Are any U.S. importers exempting Chinese tariffs? Is there a way to get around the 145%?
Not really. There may be some exceptions, Anne-Marie, maybe a little bit going north or south of us, but realistically speaking, nobody is out there talking a lot about, hey, I got a better deal coming out of China right now.
The Flexport CEO joined us earlier in the week, and he said ocean freight is down 60% from China. When do we see 100%?
Good question. It depends on how long this goes. We heard the reports overnight through Bloomberg that the folks in China are thinking about talking. What does that mean? Okay, great, but we've got to get a move on here. The other thing is that retailers are saying we've got about 5 to 7 weeks of normal inventory in the country right now. Then we start to see spot shortages if it goes on much beyond this.
In other words, yeah, it's real and it's happening, and he's got his finger on a pulse there. It is pretty worrying. Just to add another kind of anecdote or another opinion here, the CEO of Ford telling you straight up to expect massive price hikes and massive shortages. Quote, a lot of parts like fasteners, washers, carpet, wiring, looms are just not available. We can't even buy those parts here. Jim Farley, chief executive of Ford Motor, told CNN last week. Automakers and suppliers say it will take years for them to relocate assembly lines. So that's if you're talking about onshoring jobs back to the US as being the main objective of these tariffs, and they are unlikely to commit billions of dollars to domestic manufacturing because of uncertainty about the direction of trade policy. Mr. Trump has frequently changed his mind about the size of tariffs and how they should be applied. On Tuesday, he modified some of the rules to allow automakers to avoid paying duties on a portion of the components they import for 2 years. The measures provide the industry some relief, but car prices will still rise by thousands of dollars, analysts said. Yeah, it's just, this is all pretty darned chaotic, right? And it's that kind of uncertainty that is not good for CEOs, for business, for the economy. Now, when we go back to talk about Canada, involved very heavily in a trade war with the United States with their new Prime Minister Mark Carney, he had this to say.
In your second call with the president, did Mr. Trump outright say or insinuate at any point that Canada should become the 51st state?
He did not.
All right.
So, very simple answer to that. But what's really interesting, a lot of people have been mentioning this, that ever since Mark Carney came on the scene and Justin Trudeau went, he has not mentioned Canada as a 51st state. That is... he's not even once mentioned forcing Canada to be the 51st state because Trump doesn't have the cards, says this source. But I think Mark Carney, he's pretty wily. He knows his onions. He knows economics. And he's the right person, I think, for the job for Canada to put across Canada's point of view to Trump. And it's just fascinating that you have not heard that rhetoric from Trump ever since Mark Carney took charge there. Now, this is driving towards this point, which is a point I've made very consistently, that if the US wants to recede from the world, to isolate itself from the world, in fact, have a trade war with the world, but essentially take back its soft power, investment from around the world, which you talked about earlier in terms of media, but also in terms of CIA and fighting disinformation and cyber security, both defense and offense. When the US does this and wants to pull out of NATO, they are giving up power, and that means that they are not going to see the return on investment from that money that was being spent. And I talked about this in terms of spending for NATO. So we've got the situation where the US is now complaining that other NATO allies are not spending enough on defense, and lots of people agree with this. But the situation has been that actually the reason they've allowed the rest of NATO to do that for so long is because actually there is a benefit for that to take place. So if you create a dependence on you, you get to dictate to your dependents how things should go. That is the US's strength. And if they are now no longer having their tendrils of influence throughout the world in soft and hard power and trade power, then they don't get to dictate to the rest of the world how things should be. It's a bit like parenting in a sense. Like if you have children, they are your dependents. You're in a position whereby, yeah, I'm paying for everything for you, but that I am kind of therefore in charge of you, and I get to dictate to some degree, and we can work through this parentally, but I'm going to influence you as children in a direction that I think is beneficial for, hopefully for you, but for all of us as a family. It's a very tenuous analogy, this, but do you get my point? I was thinking about the word dependent and thinking, you know, the US gets a benefit from having other nations dependent on the US. And the more they push other nations to be independent of the US, that will be economic and military independence and political independence. Then they are unable to be controlled by the US so easily. The US is rescinding its control on the world. Now, if you're not American, you're looking objectively, you might think, well, that's benefit for everyone else in the world. The problem is when some of these other players are really big, like China and BRICS, and you're thinking, actually, I'd rather the US was more powerful around the world than China was more powerful around the world. But the US is giving up and China steps in. What I'm saying is that asymmetry of the US paying more for security is something that was to the benefit of the US. And that's why it's been allowed to go on for so long. Now, you could say it needs some readjustment, but the massive readjustment in the Trump isolationist wing is enforcing will not be to the benefit of the United States in the long run. And there was an amazing Balkan telephone caller into James O'Brien on LBC that sparked this kind of opinion from James O'Brien. This was an amazing telephone call, by the way, 10 minutes of brilliance of just some random person she's actually living in Italy, phoned into LBC. She says, I really follow James O'Brien, and James O'Brien nailed that opinion that I've just given to you here.
We had a world order after World War II that depended so heavily on America, and America. Yes, it's gone, and maybe it's good that we get this shove in the behind to, get over ourselves.
Yes, I mean it's a little early for silver linings, but if there are to be any, that would be one. The geopolitical reality of over-reliance. I think sometimes we overlook the fact that America both wanted and encouraged and created the environment in which over-reliance upon the United States became.
Which they are now
Boom! Boom, boom, boom. That is so succinctly put. And then she says, which are now complaining about, right? Let's just listen to that again.
Over-reliance. I think sometimes we overlook the fact that America both wanted and encouraged and created the environment in which over-reliance upon the United States became.
Which they are now complaining
about.
Yes,
exactly that. And their status on the world stage depends upon the over-reliance and the Pax Americana. So it's a typical Trump tactic, really, to
100%.
use the things that he professes to despise to attack the things that give him the power to attack the things he professes to despise. But I don't want to overcomplicate it. Let me just...
That's just such an amazing little excerpt from an interaction that goes to the heart of what I have been saying for so long. And I'm just really glad that there are other people that think that.
Which they are now complaining
about.
Yes,
exactly that. And their status on the world stage depends upon the over-reliance and the Pax Americana. So it's a typical Trump tactic, really, to use the things that he professes to despise to attack the things that give him the power to attack the things he professes to despise. But I don't want to...
Brilliant. And then just finally, and not really to do with Russia or anything we've been talking about, but just something to think about. I was talking about this with my family in the pub the other day as I was saying goodbye to my sister before she went back to New Zealand, one of my sisters. And I was talking about how water has long been thought to be the next, oil for the world, where people will be fighting over it, access to it. I think, is it the River Jordan, where, for thousands of years, everyone along a river's course has been able to access that water, use it for irrigation, use it to live. And water is the source, and certainly in some of these less temperate regions, is the source of kind of energy, power, food, wealth, health, etc., etc. And if further up the river, you're now starting to be able to dam that water or stop it reaching its end destination, where it has done for thousands of years, you can ruin a country down the road, down the river. And water will become a greater and greater resource of much. You can think about like Mad Max and Waterworld and all these kind of dystopian films, but we are getting to a position where I think, clean water becomes almost like a weapon, but the most cherished of resources. So India, we understand, has stopped the regulated flow of water through the Beglejar Dam on the Chenab River following its suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan. This marks the first suspension in the treaty's 65-year history. I would go and watch an excerpt. I'll probably play it to you in a forthcoming Geopolitics video of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell talking about the crisis in India, between India and Pakistan, and about how the population explosion has really changed things, about how the growth in I guess wealth per capita in India has sidelined Pakistan, which hasn't moved so far. China hugely grown, India hugely grown, Pakistan not so much. And then all of these, when that deal was done about that water, the population of Pakistan was tiny compared to what it is now, as was India. And now with India with 1 billion people and Pakistan with however many hundreds of millions of people, this is a much bigger issue. And you are having access to water be controlled by nations that control those rivers higher up. And wow, that could be incredibly important, but nothing to do particularly with anything else we talked about today. But I just think it's an interesting topic of discussion. Anyway, that's enough for me, guys. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. This one's been a long one. Ta-da.